This morning we are talking about youth violence right here in the city. And among the crimes that we're seeing, an 18-year-old charged for his role in a robbery crew that allegedly assaulted an off-duty police officer in the Bronx last week. Meanwhile, two teenage girls facing gang assault charges in the deadly assault of a cab driver in Queens just 2 weeks ago.
So what's troubling is the number of young people being arrested for these types of crimes. So we want to delve into the psychology behind youth violence. For that, we turn to licensed clinical psychologist Dr. Jeffrey Gardere, who is joining us this morning. Good morning, Dr. Jeff. Good to see you.
Good morning. Good morning. Great to see you both.
So let's take a look back at these ages again. The suspects, the youngest just 13, the oldest 18. So what developmentally, where are they exactly, their stage? I mean, you'd think that they're old enough to know the difference between right and wrong, so this doesn't really make any sense.
Well, they should know the difference between right and wrong, but the other thing that we know, and studies have shown over and over again, that the brain does not fully mature until an individual is in their mid-20s, 26, 27. So impulse control, making some of the right decisions, considering the right options, quite often are not based just on common sense or morality, but oftentimes is based on physiology, emotion, not being able to control that emotion. And so that's why we see a lot of acting out in these earlier stages and not having the best judgment.
You know, Dr. Jeff, we've seen an increase in crime and violent attacks across the board, especially since the pandemic began, right? And when it comes to youth, what are some of the specific triggers that might be prompting these kind of behaviors?
Well, we know part of it is social media, even though it's meant to be something that is connecting people. Quite often we see there's a lot of negativity there, misinformation. We also see that with the pandemic, incredible increase in levels of anxiety, in depression, pediatric visits to the emergency room over suicidal ideation, post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, we know that kids have been completely disillusioned, often around issues with social isolation through the pandemic. And let's admit it, one of the things that we've seen with the pandemic is the falling apart of some aspects of society. I mean, we are a very violence-fueled society at this point. So many people are dysregulated, and that, I believe, is part of a culture shock. And then, of course, financially, what's going on socioeconomically in the world since the pandemic. It was bad before, but it's even worse, and it's really bad for other groups that have been disenfranchised for such a long time.
Well, I mean, you mentioned social media. A lot of teen culture does revolve around social media. We've heard the mayor talk about drill music that glorifies gang violence. So how much does that actually, in your opinion, influence the youth?
Well, that's a big controversy, isn't it? You know, drill music, Pac-Man was the individual who's credited with that kind of music, drill music meaning, you know, the rat-tat-tat of firepower towards other gangs and so on. But we've seen that with this particular music, you know, there have been other people, for example, like Pop Smoke, who have used that kind of music to really give a message as to how difficult it is to grow up in some of these neighborhoods. So, you know, like gangster rap for a long time that had, no pun intended, a bad rap. I think if you just look at drill music, just look at the culture, you know, around that kind of music, it's just too easy to just point fingers. It's much more complex than that right now.
Yeah, I mean, the whole issue of psychology of youth is just so complex. Are you seeing an increase, Dr. Jeff, in the number of youth suffering from, I guess, mental illness and then turning to drugs and alcohol, right?
Yeah, a lot of them, you're absolutely right, Dan. A lot of kids are self-medicating, again, through some illicit substances, through some pharmaceutical substances, and so on. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we as adults are not paying enough attention. We are suffering emotionally ourselves due to the pandemic and, you know, socioeconomic issues that are endemic to large cities and, you know, some rural areas. And so quite often we can look at the kids as perhaps being the issue, but at the end of the day, we as society, we as parents, we as school administrators, we as a justice system have to take much more responsibility, and certainly as a mental health, sort of industry. Are we doing enough to help our kids? And that's why I really like the fact that in the schools, we are giving a larger role to our nurses, our social workers, our school counselors, because they're the ones who are right there, boots on the ground.
Yeah, perhaps that's really the answer, right? Because when you think about what a lot of parents and families are going through right now, especially after the pandemic, parents who have lost their jobs, they're stressed out about that. And they're really thinking mostly about that and can't always just sit there and focus on exactly what their child is going through. So what other answers what other answers are there when parents are so overloaded with the stress of just everyday life?
Well, I think this is where it does take a community to raise a child. And that's why we do have to partner up with our schools. We do have to partner up. There are so many after school sorts of activities, agencies that are available to work with kids, community organizations, advocating for our kids. I think those are some of the most important things that we can do. Look, let's be honest. I get calls from many parents who want to get their kids into treatment, but the emergency rooms are not keeping the kids. They just don't have enough room. As we know, there's a pipeline from school to jail instead of a pipeline from school to getting mental health treatment. So we have to recognize this isn't just about kids acting out. It's not just about kids being bad, but it's about youth who are lost through this pandemic, youth who feel disenfranchised, who feel depressed, and they're acting all of that out. Many of them feel that there's no hope, and we have to create hope. We have to create opportunities for them, or we will fail them, and they will be the first ones to fall.
And they also need easier access to that help, because it's not always affordable for families, right?
Absolutely. So smashing the stigma around talking about mental illness, but most importantly, fortifying our schools, working with our schools to address not just their academic issues, but their social, emotional, mental issues, I think is so important.
And that better happen in schools at a young age, because when I've talked about it. When I was in school, mental health was not talked about, and it was something that wasn't even offered to dive into when I was a teenager. Because there's a difference between acting out and then going the violent route, and that's what we're seeing play out. Dr. Jeff Gardere, always good to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.